Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. When it comes to games from the beat 'em up genre, we have covered a bloody lot of them on here. Many of these games we have focused on have come from two giants producing games in the field, Konami and Capcom, who both contributed plenty of great beat 'em ups to the gaming universe during the early 90s. Amongst these many videos, we looked at the fantastic 6-player X-Men arcade game by Konami, which is probably the most famous game containing a Marvel license from this era. X-Men was bright, colourful and offered both comic book readers and gaming fans alike a top-notch experience, which was unmatched when it came to its multiplayer capabilities. The Konami title is fondly remembered today for what it brought to the gaming table. But did you know that Capcom also produced a top-tier Marvel superheroes beat-em up in this same time frame too? Today we are going to be looking at The Punisher, a 1993 arcade game that was one of a slew of beat-em up greats created by the Japanese gaming development house and publisher throughout the early phases of that decade. In this video we are going to look at how this game fared against its contemporaries of its time and look at some of the elements that make this game so special. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of The Punisher, a game that would be so influential that it would rock history and shape gaming forever. Yeah! After the huge steps forward Technos had made with their creation of the Double Dragon series in the 1980s, various development houses wanted to replicate the economic success the gameplay experience had resulted in. One of these companies was of course Capcom, releasing Final Fight in 1989, refining the brawler experience even further with their game that took influence from the movie Streets of Fire. The leaps forward Capcom had made with Final Fight would result in the first of many beat-em-ups from the company, including other games we have looked at in depth on here before, such as Captain Commando, Alien vs Predator and Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. All of these games were critically well received, and along with Konami and Sega, they have become one of the world leaders in creating games of this ilk. So it is not surprising really that Marvel Comics would allow all three of these companies to develop beat-em-ups using various superheroes from their IP catalogue. Their universe and beat-em-ups were a match made in heaven really. In fact, when it comes to Marvel Comics in the world of gaming, despite there being a lot of gems to play, they did not appear to be that fussy with regards to who they did business with. Provided the company could make money from their IPs when used for various gaming projects, they were happy to work with a variety of different developers and publishers. Despite this though, when it came to console gaming, Marvel Comics appeared to work almost exclusively with Acclaim between 1990 and 1994, often publishing Marvel games under the LJN brand, which they also happen to own. If you have watched my previous videos, or any channel for that matter covering games of old, you will know how inconsistent this publisher was when it came to quality. They would chop and change which development house handled a project on a whim and would often rush out broken games as quickly as possible, relying on the success of a TV or movie license more than their actual quality of work, which would result in Marvel console games from the period varying in quality a lot. As mentioned though, Sega, Konami and Capcom would all publish fantastic Marvel games during this period, with games they had developed for the arcade format, a medium which was not choked by Acclaim's licensing stranglehold. Capcom's first ever work using a Marvel comic book character would of course involve a character known as The Punisher. The Punisher first popped up in the Amazing Spider-Man comic book series in 1974. The character, created by writer Jerry Conway and artists John Romita Sr. and Ross Andrew, was a Sicilian-American vigilante who employs murder, kidnapping, extortion, coercion, threats of violence and torture in his campaign against crime. In The Punisher's initial appearance, he would actually appear as an antagonist who had no qualms about killing gangsters, something that most superheroes of the time would refrain from doing. On his arrival, the Punisher was determined to kill Spider-Man, who was wanted for the apparent murder of Norman Osborn. Later, this complex character engaged in extensive soul searching as to what is the right thing to do. This troubled individual was driven by the deaths of his wife and 2 children who were killed by the mob for witnessing a killing in New York City's Central Park. The Punisher wages a one-man war on crime while employing the use of various weapons and firearms. Spider-Man, who is himself no stranger to such torment, concludes that the Punisher's problems made his own seem like a birthday party. The novel character was conceived by Jerry Conway and was mainly inspired by The Executioner, a popular book series created by author Don Pendleton, in which a Vietnam veteran, Mark Bolan, becomes a serial killer of criminals after the mafia-related deaths of his family. Conway states, "I was fascinated by the Don Pendleton Executioner character, which was fairly popular at the time, and I wanted to do something that was inspired by that." The Punisher was an anomaly in Marvel's cornucopia of characters, and his brutal nature would result in him becoming a hit with readers, leading to him appearing on a regular basis, teaming up with both Spider-Man and other heroes such as Captain Capitalism and Nightcrawler throughout the 1970s and early 80s. This popularity apparently even caught Conway by surprise, as he was originally not intended to be an everlasting character. By 1986, the Punisher had his own miniseries, which was popular enough to result in the character receiving his own ongoing comic book series in 1987. In fact, the Punisher was so popular, he'd received 2 spin-off comic book series too. The Punisher War Journals, which lasted for 80 issues starting in 1988, and the Punisher Warzone starting in 1992. The character was having a hot streak for Marvel, so it is no surprise that he would receive his own video games. Whilst Capcom's effort is most fondly remembered, they would not get the first Punisher crack of the whip. That honour would instead go to that dirty video game content farm, Acclaim/LJN in 1990, the watch mojo of bad video game publishers in the 80s and 90s. In this one, the player controls the Punisher character from an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, shooting thugs and battling supervillains. The game is often criticised for delivering a miserable experience due to the game's terrible controls. Acclaim will be back in 1991 with a Game Boy titled The Punisher: The Ultimate Payback, which was another over-the-shoulder third-person perspective shooter. This game is basically like the NES game, only even more miserable. There was also another Punisher game made back in 1990, this one not published by LJN, due to being developed by Home Computers Microprose, and would be published on the Amiga, Atari ST, and DOS, featuring 3 different modes of gameplay. The effort was no better than what LJN could come up with though, and the home computer game is full of inconsistent quality, poor controls, and various bugs. In fact, the best fact about this game does not relate to the gameplay at all, but instead the fact that after the release of this title, the Punisher was indexed by the Federal Department for Media Harmful to Young Persons of Germany, in a list of games deemed to be a bad influence for younger gamers. So whilst the game is largely forgotten now, at least it upset the Germans in an era before video game certification. Finally, in 1993, Japanese Capcom would finally have an opportunity to do the Punisher brand justice, after various Western developers and publishers had dragged the brand through the mud in gaming. The arcade title would feature the same style beat-em-up gameplay that many of Capcom's other hits featured. However, this game, The Punisher, would also contain a range of usable weapons and fantastic comic-style presentation, which would help separate it from the pack, all of which we'll discuss more about shortly. Like all the Capcom beat-em-ups of the period, The Punisher features a basic story illustrated throughout the game, starting off with an opening cutscene. Through this medium, the game starts out with showcasing the Punisher's origin story, where US Marine Captain Frank Castle witnesses a mob killing while enjoying a picnic with his family in Central Park. Fearing any witnesses, the killers gun down the family. Frank survives, vowing revenge, becoming the Punisher. The game follows the Punisher's vigilante mission for revenge through this side-scrolling beat-em-up, The game was notable at the time of release for featuring a new arcade system that allowed over 10 enemies to appear on screen at the same time without slowdown, which was an improvement over earlier Capcom games. Like most classics of the era, the Punisher is of course cooperative, with a second player controlling SHIELD agent Nick Fury. The game's controls, like other Capcom brawlers, allowing players to perform kicks, throws and punches that can be chained together into combos and special attacks to dispatch your foes, allowing progression from stage to stage. Melee weapons also play a large role in this title's combat, which can all be acquired through the same means as in other Capcom beat-em-ups too. You know, on the floor, in crates and from enemies, all the usual sources. Restorative health pickups obviously make a welcome return too. In terms of fighting in this game, the comic book setting is further emphasised when onomatopoeias such as BLAM flash up on the screen as players shoot bullets. The game places a heavier emphasis on firearms than with many other games of this style, resulting in the game featuring a relatively high level of violence for this sort of title, a trait which Alien vs Predator would seem to inherit and push further at a later date. The game begins with the playable characters crashing through the glass roof of an illegal casino in pursuit of the mafia enforcer Bruno Costa, who ordered the killing of the castle's family. Players must take out some generic thugs in this short opening part of the game, before action spills out onto the streets of New York City. Here there are barrels to throw, varied enemy sprites to take out, and multiple weapons to both take and pick up to use in melee action. Players manage to board a moving bus where they find Bruno, but he escapes, leaving players to fight Scully, the first large boss fighter of the game. The boss fight features scrolling in the background to help create an illusion of movement, a nice visual effect which Capcom used in the train stage of Final Fight 4 years earlier. More smaller enemy sprites join the fray, but this first boss battle does not prove particularly challenging. After defeating this minor comic book villain, the Punisher interrogates Scully and gets the information he needs, and then promptly shoots him. Still on track of Bruno, the Punisher infiltrates the mob's Panther Verde resort in Florida via a water duct. Once out of the pool, we see palm trees in both the background and foreground, which help differentiate the area well. As expected, there are lots of sprites to take out here, with varied weapons, including these female sprites who, as expected, are dressed in latex, just like in every beat-em-up ever, who as always give away their trampling services for free. Combat continues in the interior of the building of the resort, with red carpeted floors to help illustrate the grandeur, along with suited and booted foes who continue to illustrate the exclusivity. Players catch up with Bruno, who is now in the most stereotypical villain room of all time, complete with a huge glass aquarium in the background. All that is missing is sharks with freaking laser beams on their heads, and we would be full on Dr. Evil here. We find Bruno here is suddenly killed by a robot called Guard Droid. Bruno tells Frank the Kingpin has programmed it to terminate him. Players then have to fight this huge towering mechanical opponent, who just so happens to have the ability to shoot lasers, making up for the lack of mechanically altered sharks. Next up, the Punisher then raids a major drug smuggling ring at the local harbour. The stage, named Waterfront Warfare, places a much heavier emphasis on firearm usage than in previous stages, with lots of pickups quickly becoming available. Players are not allowed to get comfortable too quickly though, as tougher Terminator-like mechanical foes surface often throughout this stage. The level also features some nice diagonal scrolling, which mixes up the action, until eventually players get to face off against the Bone Breaker, a wheeled opponent who has a range of projectile attacks, including the use of missiles and flamethrowers. After defeating this opponent, players indulge in a bonus round, which plays similarly to the barrel smashing rounds in Street Fighter 2. Only in this Capcom classic, players can use guns, due to the whole story of this game taking place in the USA, the gun crime capital and murder capital of the entire Western world. Stage 5 takes place in the Kingpin's poppy field at a cave in Arizona, presenting a setting that is certainly a lot more grown up than anything found in the X-Men Konami arcade title. There are mining tracks down here that the player walks along as they brawl against and shoot foes, before combat shifts to a moving train. The rest of the stage, once aboard the train, features plenty of variety and great scrolling effects before players take on a bushwhacker, the commander of this freight train. This opponent, who can transform his arm into a Mega Man-like blaster, is accompanied by many enemy sprites, but once he is defeated, players can progress. Past this point, the Kingpin has had enough of the Punisher's nonsense, so puts a contract on his head. This stage of the game sees players wading through excrement in the sewers, which is a perfect visual metaphor for trying to find good games published using Marvel licenses. There are a lot of enemies to take down here, and some nice visual effects on display as players trudge through this filth. Ugh. When players finally escape the sewers, the game contrasts the pleasantness of being outside well by landing players in a lush green forest. We could be in the wonderful world of Cadillacs and dinosaurs right now instead. As players progress, the level of challenge slowly ramps up as more and more sprites appear on screen. The boss of the area though is a bit of a cop-out, as players have to fight Guard Droid 2, who is basically just a red palette swap of the first Guard Drive boss. Lazy. The final stage, known as the Last Punishment, sees players arrive in a Trump Tower-like setting, which looks pretty similar to the closing stages in the majority of beat-em-ups, where the final boss literally rolls the red carpet out for the arriving players. If you have played any beat-em-ups, you know exactly what you would get here. Ridiculous amounts of enemy sprites all over the place to take out, and since we have not got one thus far in the game, a bloody lift section, which, as I point out every video, it would be illegal to make a beat-em-up without making a lift stage. After ascending the lift, players even end up in a mechanical looking factory-like boiler room, another trope of a genre we can add to our tick list. Atop the tower, players finally get to face the Kingpin, the fattiest of all fatty boom booms to appear in any beat-em-up game. After defeating this long life-gauged opponent, the building itself begins to shake, as the Punisher and Nick Fury escape the building before it collapses World Trade Center style. In the game's closing moments, we were informed 355 criminals died in the collapse of the building, but the Kingpin's body was never found, allowing the story to come to an end while maintaining the status quo of the comic book series. Now, as you can see from the gameplay we just looked at, the Punisher ticks all the right boxes to be a member of the beat-em-up elite. The game features fun combat, great cartoon visuals, plenty of melee weapons, and even a more mature theme than many titles that came before it. I would say the game's only weak point really is that it only offers 2-player support, whereas many other games of the era offered up to 4-player cooperative play, or in X-Men's case, 6-player. Whilst Konami's X-Men game is bright, colourful and very comic bookish, the Punisher feels more dark and gritty, which is a good reflection of Frank Castle himself to be fair, so Capcom delivered a perfect atmospheric experience to represent the Punisher franchise. Game Power gave the arcade version of the Punisher a perfect partial score for the game's fun factor, remarking that this game's outstanding feature is its gorgeous graphics, which capture the dark, somber mood of the Punisher comic books. Game Fan Reviewer wrote the Punisher proved to be everything I dreamed of in a traditional Final Fight style game, describing it as definitely the greatest side-scrolling fighting game ever, as well as the bloodiest, goriest fighting game since Mortal Kombat in his preview. Clearly very impressed with Capcom's work on this game, it appears that Marvel would allow Capcom the right to publish the next Punisher home title, rather than have Acclaim do the job like they had done when butchering many previous Marvel licensed games in the past. I assume that during this time frame Capcom in Japan were working on a lot of projects simultaneously, so they would outsource American company Sculptured Software to develop a home port of the Punisher arcade game. Sculptured Software would be the same company who would be tasked that year with porting WrestleMania the arcade game to the Mega Drive, the very game we looked at last week, which was not too bad to be fair. But what about the Punisher on the Mega Drive? How did they do? The Mega Drive port of the game was massively graphically scaled back from the version that appeared on Capcom's System 1 arcade hardware. As expected really, in addition to the game's worse graphics and sound, there are lesser varieties of enemies and a smaller number of objects on screen than what could be found within the original. Most of the breakable objects found in the previous version of the game have also been rendered unbreakable, which is a further drawback with this version of the game. Amusingly, the game also got Nintendo-style treatment on the Sega system, in that lots of censorship was implemented. The skimpy latex outfits on the female characters have been changed, Nick Fury loses his trademark cigar, and the violence has been visually toned down too. This title would not arrive in my region until 1995, making it one of the later Mega Drive games and one of the most valuable and expensive games in which collectors often want to add to their collections. However, I don't think the experience matches what ridiculous prices people are willing to pay. Feedback was mixed for the Mega Drive port, with video games calling it a decent exercise in vigilante mayhem that is surprisingly fun yet fairly standard. While EGM on the other hand criticised the title and said the whole game comes across as routine and bland. GamePro outright panned the port, commenting that the special moves are too difficult to pull off, the sound effects are weak, the gameplay is generic and the graphics never come close to the coin-op game that Discart is based on. Next Generation would not like it either, stating that not much good can be found in the game and the person responsible for putting out the Punisher deserves a good spanking. Apart from the butchered Mega Drive version of the game, at one point in time a PlayStation port was lined up too, which was in development by Crystal Dynamics, the company who held the prestigious accolade of being the first licensed developer for the 3DO. However, sadly, their PlayStation Punisher port was never completed, despite one home port of the game never being finished and the Mega Drive version being pretty disappointing. Marvel Entertainment loved the Capcom arcade game and were equally impressed with some of Capcom's other work. Bringing the success of the Punisher into account, paired with Capcom's track record for quality, Capcom seemed like they would be a sensible long-term business partner for Marvel Entertainment to work with going forward. The trust generated by the quality delivered with the Punisher, along with the loyalty paid to the franchise's source material, this would mark the beginning of a partnership between Marvel Comics and Capcom, which would lead to many great things. A Marvel vs fighting game would just make sense considering what Capcom had done with Street Fighter 2 previously, which would result in Marvel Entertainment working with Capcom to make a brilliant X-Men fighting game. The contract with Marvel would even stipulate that Capcom could include a character from the Street Fighter franchise in the game, so developers included Akuma as a secret character. As we all know, this would eventually lead to X-Men vs Street Fighter and the many Marvel vs Capcom games that were to come. The Punisher marked the beginning of one of entertainment's most beloved partnerships and crossovers in history. To end this story on a sad note though, despite the Punisher's impact and influence on the Marvel partnership, he would never appear as a playable fighter within any Marvel vs Capcom game himself, which to be fair seems like a massive injustice considering what he has been responsible for. In my opinion, some vigilante justice needs to be served against Capcom. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad history of the Punisher, the beat 'em up game that would be so influential that it would rock history, changing Capcom and Marvel's relationship forever. Let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of today's content and which game you would like to see me talk about in the future. Do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive an update every time I upload a video. Today's topic was chosen by the kind people who back this channel on Patreon, who support this channel in a number of ways to assist its growth. Your input is everything and highly appreciated as always. I would like to give massive thanks and shout outs to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Balder, Philip Manth, Camber Rambo 82, Azrael Rorikai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, SpongeMat B, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Bubba Kitty, Ron Studd, Hootie McBoob, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marco Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Darn, Adam Castin, Gregory Moragiewicz, Rick67, Lewis Fiant, John Bates, David Bow, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, RetroVersion.com, Since Spaces, Andrew Bazanski, and all of my other fantastic patrons. Thank you so much for helping me produce these videos. It's all very helpful. Cheers. Yeah.